Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the class BMN 521 seminar in Buddhist terminology. Today is February 6, 2023, our fourth session, yes, 4 weeks. And before I forget, next week, the 5th week, right? It will be the midterm examination. So check your syllabus and see. Next week, I remember. Next week, we will be having the, what you may call the midterm examination. Before that, I think, I hope you all are doing fine with studies. As we discussed last week about the Pali Text Society, one of the pioneering, unique attempt made by the British scholars to propagate Buddhism. And in our sense here in this class, actually translating Pali Buddhist texts into English. So a lot of terminology evolved out of that effort because of the Pali Text Society and its academic work. And today, our focus is on the Sanskrit Buddhist texts. As you may know, Pali and Sanskrit are the two original languages that you find the early Buddhist texts are composed, Pali and Sanskrit. As you may know, that Sanskrit is one of the oldest languages in the world, perhaps the oldest, because Veda is the Hindu sacred texts. They were written in Sanskrit. They are almost over 5,000 years old. And the language, Sanskrit language, is considered to be Aryan languages. One of the, so there are some families of the languages. So Aryan languages are the ancient languages like German, Russian. All these languages are Aryan languages. So Sanskrit belongs to that category. It's one of the root languages. When I say root languages, it means from that language, many other languages evolved. Many other languages developed. So they are called root languages. So Sanskrit is one of the root languages and very old language. And the Buddhist texts, originally, I suppose you know that Buddha did not speak Sanskrit. Buddha did not even speak Pali. It's a kind of Middle Indic language, they say, Middle Indic language, Prakrit. Pali is the ancient Buddhist language where you find the Buddhist texts composed or written in that language. During the time of the Buddha, when the Buddha was alive, nothing was written down. Nothing. His teachings were not written down at the time of the Buddha, not even in Pali or Sanskrit. So when they start writing the texts was a different story. Perhaps when you were studying about the Tripitaka, the Pali canon, you should have noticed that those were written down about 400, at least 400 years after the passing of the Buddha. Okay. And then how comes Sanskrit? Sanskrit, in India, the Hindu tradition, Vedic tradition was so powerful, and they use Sanskrit. Hindu tradition is based on mostly based on Sanskrit language. So the influence of the elite, the high class, Brahmanas, came into existence in Indian society. So Pali language kind of decreased, deteriorated. Excuse me. Sanskrit came into popularity in Indian culture, Indian society. So the monks and the other important people thought that they should start writing Buddhist texts in Sanskrit language. That's how Sanskrit became popular. And especially the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism during the turn of the century, to be exact, like the first century CE, that around that time, maybe perhaps a little bit earlier than that, popularization of Sanskrit was so high that Mahayana Buddhism belongs to that period. Mahayana Buddhism arose during that period. So what they did was they had the chance, they had the advantage of using that language to popularize their teachings. So that's how Sanskrit language came to Buddhist fore. Otherwise, originally, Sanskrit was not a Buddhist language. Sanskrit was a Hindu language. Hindu tradition was written in Sanskrit. Hindu elite, Brahmanas, were the people who were using Sanskrit. It is very cultured language, highly educated language. So not a slang language, no. It's a refined language. So only refined people, cultured people, civilized people could use Sanskrit. So in that way, see, it is not the language of the common people, no. Sanskrit was not the language of the common people. Language of the common people perhaps was Pali. Pali and Prakrit, those kind of slang languages. Slang might not be a right word there, but kind of lower level languages. So Mahayana texts then originally were written in Sanskrit languages, elite languages, classical language. So now what we are trying to understand here is that Buddhist Sanskrit text in Buddhist Sanskrit, when they came into existence, now roughly around the 1st century CE and onwards, they developed. And in the academic world, there is a special category of Sanskrit called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. Classical Sanskrit is different and Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit is different. Not too much difference, but the terms and formations of sentences are a little bit different. So it's called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. So when we are talking about the translations of the Sanskrit texts into English, first, of course, the translations was done by Chinese monks, not to English, but their own language, Chinese. From Silk Route, these Buddhism came to China. Buddhism went to China, and Chinese monks collected Sanskrit. Excuse me, it's midnight here. Sanskrit Buddhist texts were collected by the Chinese monks, and they started translating them into Chinese. That was like in the 3rd, 4th centuries, 4th century CE. Kumarajiva is very famous on that. And they had a very refined translation project in China. So that was the first time that Buddhist texts, Sanskrit Buddhist texts were translated. So, and then later on, when the New World came, with the, imperialism and colonization, India was colonized by the British. So their influence was so important. And last time we saw that even Polytech Society was started because of the colonization. The civil servants, they were educated people. They had some interest in the local languages. In this sense, Pali, Sanskrit, and other languages, Sinhalese, all those languages, they were really interested in. And then they are the people who opened this door to the West. So in Sanskrit, actually, one person called Sir Monier Williams. Sir Monier Williams, in 19th century, he was born in 1810 or 1812, around that time. That means early 19th century. And he passed away towards the end of the 19th century. He did a marvelous job. He was born in Bombay, in India, but he's not Indian. He was a son of a civil servant, an army general or somebody. And somehow this person went to England, and he studied there. He became the professor of Sanskrit in London, University of London. And he compiled a dictionary. That's why I wanted to mention his name. He's the first person to compile a dictionary, Sanskrit English dictionary, where you find a lot of Sanskrit words, English meanings are given there. So that's a very good dictionary. It's still today, it's accepted as a valid good dictionary. And that's how the door was open to many other people to take a look at the Sanskrit Buddhist texts. Monier Williams was not a Buddhist. He did not want to, do research on Buddhist studies, but he was interested in Indian culture and Indian studies. But that helped the others, Sanskrit-loving people. They could use that dictionary and his research, and he started the Indian Institute in London University and all that. All these things helped pave the way for propagation of Buddhist studies in the Western world. And in 1950s, around 1953, another gentleman called Edgerton, scholar, Sanskrit scholar, he published another dictionary. It's called Buddhist Hybrid Dictionary. See, I told you earlier that there's a special sort of language called Buddhist Hybrid Sanskrit. Not the classical Sanskrit, Buddhist Hybrid Sanskrit. That dictionary came into being in 1950, somewhere in 50s. And after that, it was easier for people to translate Buddhist text in Sanskrit. And that's how started the Buddhist Sanskrit texts came into popularity among the Westerners. And as you may know that the earliest Sanskrit Buddhist texts are Mahayana texts. So don't expect the Theravada, Tripitaka and other things in Sanskrit. They have the Mahayana texts like Mahaprajna Paramita, many texts in that Prajna Paramita literature. They call it Prajna Paramita literature. And many other sutras and sastras. These are the Sanskrit texts. So they are the texts that were translated into English. Prajna Paramita is very huge collection of texts. So they are very popular now. So different scholars have translated these things into English. And so the terminology, Buddhist terminology was developed by those scholars in translating the Buddhist texts. So that is the history. Now when you focus on the, as I told you before, translation and finding proper terms, developing terminology. Because when you are translating something from a different language, different cultural setting, it's very difficult to convey the exact same meaning in a different language. So that's a challenging work, a challenging thing. So a translator has to rely on solid, stable terminology, not loose terms, solid terms to convey the original meanings of the original text. To be faithful to the original text, correct terminology is essential. So I think these two dictionaries paved the way for the Sanskrit terminology. And now, of course, there are many scholars, many publications, English publications of the Buddhist texts. So if you go online and see, many texts are translated into English from Sanskrit. Many different scholars in different universities, they have Sanskrit scholars, so they have translated many. And you may know that even in Tibetan, it's more popular, I think. translation of Tibetan text into English. So that's way Buddhist texts, you find in many translations. And so do a little bit research, on the Sanskrit Buddhist texts, especially Mahayana Buddhist texts, and how they were translated into English, not Chinese, not Tibetan, not any other language, English. So it is not that old, very last few centuries, 1 or 2 centuries. The translations are have been appearing. So please do a little research on this thing. And I wind up the lecture for today, and it is on Sanskrit Buddhist texts and their translations into English. So please do a little research on that thing and do the homework. And remember, next week will be the midterm. Thank you. Have a nice weekend.